Greetings, travelers. Welcome back to Tales from the Enchanted Forest with your hosts, Fox and Sparrow.
Salutations, one and all. Welcome back, everybody. We're so excited. It is spring, finally. I can say that. Officially. I'm so happy we're in that season, and it immediately got cold for me, so, you know, spring is doing its spring thing of just toying with my feelings.
Yep, and now that it's officially spring, we now have snow in the forecast, which is very, very typical.
I wonder if this just happens every year and we just get surprised by it. That, you know, that it becomes like supposed to be warmer in theory, but then it's just colder, and it's just, weather is weird.
Yeah, I mean, that's our favorite topic is weather. But the past couple weeks have been full of just different events and holidays. We had World Storytelling Day on the 20th. We had World Sparrow Day on the 20th. And we also had the Persian New Year on the 20th. So a lot to celebrate.
Lots going on. I've done this before in the past, but I've been in habit now of going to a website that tells me what national day it is to celebrate, which is kind of how we found out that National Sparrow Day and National Storytelling Day landed on the same day, which is fun. But I've been using that a lot to annoy my coworkers. Like the other day, it was National Companies That Care Day, and I secretly just sent that to my my coworkers, being like, "Hey guys, guess what?"
Well, do you want to hear what national days are today?
When
we're recording this, by the way, this is March 23rd, so a bit of fourth wall break. But we have National Tamale Day, National Chia Day, National Melba Toast Day, National Puppy Day, and National Chip and Dip Day.
Interesting.
So lots of food, and then also puppies. And then when you're listening to this podcast, it'll be National Little Red Wagon Day, which is always the last Wednesday in March. It'll also be National Nougat Day, National Spinach Day, and Manatee Appreciation Day. Again, always the last Wednesday in March.
There's a lot of good stuff. I find this is a good way to get a laugh every day. I don't know why I'm plugging this, but this is apparently the thing I'm plugging today is looking these up. If I ever am like just down one day, I'm like, there's got to be something I can celebrate today. And I pull up the website to find out what I can just celebrate. And if it's a day where I should just be eating chips or whatever, like today, I'll just do that suddenly. I'm like, hey, gotta honor the day. Can't forget, you know?
I feel like there are too many things.
There is, but that also gives you options, you know? Like, if you don't really care for manatees, you can really just focus in on the red wagons and vice versa. So you always have a thing you can just pick to celebrate that day.
See, the Little Red Wagon concept, I've seen that only on TV. I've never seen an actual child with a Little Red Wagon.
I had a Little Red Wagon growing up.
You had a little... You're the children from the TV.
I mean, it wasn't like perfectly the iconic, you know, that you see on TV. It was a more plasticky version. But yeah, I had a Little Red Wagon. I needed something to bring all of my crap over to my friend's house so that my friends' parents can be like, why do we have more crap than normal? Oh, right. Now let's shuttle it back to the other house, and just the continuous going back and forth of our toys and shenanigans.
Oh my God. The death of the little red wagon will come with the digital age, because we can just send our friends things online.
But that's why we got to celebrate the day, so we can honor and remember the importance of the little red wagon.
See, I always put like kids having the little red wagon. It's starting to feel like a tongue twister now.
It kind of is.
Put kids having the little red wagon as one of those TV only things. And there are a bunch of things that I think of TV only things that probably do exist because they probably came from a real concept.
Oh, yeah.
For example, the other day I made my husband watch She's the Man because he's never seen it.
Oh,
and
such a good movie.
I'm like, that's a gap in your education, actually. So we will watch it. And the idea of a kissing booth came up. So in the movie, there's a kissing booth at a carnival that, you know, Viola's mother signs her up for.
Yeah.
And my husband was just like, is that a thing? And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, do people have these kissing things where you can just pay to kiss someone? Isn't that creepy? Isn't that weird? And I don't think I've ever fully thought of it as something that existed in real life that wasn't just a trope, because there's obviously the kissing booth movies, and like it happens in some teen movies where there's like a kissing booth and it's supposed to be this huge moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just like, is this a real thing that happens outside of movies? And apparently it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I was just like, huh. I always thought this was just like a weird gimmicky thing. And then, of course, as guys do, he had to ruin the concept because he's like, that's really creepy. How could people do that? Like, and her own mother. I was like, all right. And then also, I mean, he did try and watch She's the Man and talk about how the soccer wasn't accurate, because in one scene they were all kicking in different directions, and I was like, all right.
All right. And he was probably like upset because they weren't calling it football as well, right?
He wasn't that worried about that. I think it was just more so he's like, what is happening? Why are they doing flying kicks? And I was like, oh, listen, the movie is about her. The soccer is the aesthetic.
Shakespeare, gosh dang it.
Yeah, I'm like, it's Shakespeare, and honestly, Shakespeare would have loved it. R.I.P.
But yeah, there's a lot of good days to celebrate, and if you're celebrating the Little Red Wagon Day, hope you're enjoying that. But earlier this month, we had St. Patrick's Day. And while it has since come and gone, this spring feeling made me think we were due for a fun Celtic story. So I went reading through some of the fantastical Irish folklore and found this lovely fairy-centric tale. Specifically, this story comes from the 1906 book Irish Fairy Tales by Edmund Leamy. This story is called The Fairy Tree of Dooros, and Dooros is actually a place in Ireland just near Galway.
So, having heard the story before, I know this story, well, from you. I know the story has a different type of fairy tree, but I do love the concept of fairy trees as a whole. So Irish fairy trees are usually ash or hawthorn trees that stand alone with rocks circling the base. And so Irish fairies from the mythological cycles, they were these divine beings who reside in Ireland, and they were called the Tuatha Danann. So once they were defeated by the Mycenaeans, they went underground to chambers under Ireland's surface called the Sidhes. So fairy trees were considered passageways or doors to the other world, and so that's why there were lots of superstitions around them, and you couldn't cut them down or you'd have bad luck. And usually the story went that if you cut one down, you'd be plagued or cursed, or if one fairy tree died, after, let's say, 400 years, another one would grow up in its spot. And a book series that I recently read and loved that covered Irish fairies and included stuff about fairy doors and specifically fairy trees was Heather Fawcett's Emily Wilde series. So this series is it's slower than most fantasy stories. It follows Emily Wilde, who's kind of a dryadologist, and so she's studying fairies in this world where fairies are something to be studied. And so she's writing a research paper, and she's writing this encyclopedia. And so she goes around researching fairies, and it's quite interesting because it's a new take. So instead of, fighting the fairies or trying to overthrow them in kind of an epic story, she's researching them. And so it shows you lots of different sides of fairies. So that's my recommendation. If you enjoy this tale, then head over and read that series as well.
And with that, I invite you all to gather around and cozy up for this magical tale of the fairy tree of Dooros. Like all good fairy tales, this story begins with once upon a time. But instead of focusing on a beautiful young maiden or a brave poor boy, instead, our story begins at the end of a sports match, specifically a hurling match between the fairies of the West and the lake fairies. The fairies of the West were victorious, and they celebrated and danced until their shoes were worn right through. So, the fairies posted up in the Dooros woods, where they continued to party and celebrate, while also attempting to make new shoes before they journeyed back to fairyland. During this merrymaking, they also enjoyed the fairy berries they brought for the journey. While these little red berries looked very much like berries found on a rowan tree, they were very, very different. For you see, fairy berries were much sweeter, and more delicious than any other fruit. And they also had a magical effect on humans. For if an old, feeble man were to eat just one of these berries, he would become young and active once more. Or if a maiden who was not handsome ate one, she would become lovelier than a beautiful flower. Because of this, fairies were very careful with the berries, so they would not fall into mortal hands. Even if one were to fall onto the ground, a tree would instantly spring up from the spot it landed on. So before the fairies left fairyland, they had to swear to the king and the queen that they would not lose a single berry. But of course, while the feasting and celebration continued in the Dooros woods, one tiny fairy accidentally dropped a single berry. The tiny fairy did not realize what had happened until a week later, when they had already returned to fairyland. The fairy berry tree in Dooros woods was soon discovered by the queen's pages when they searched for butterflies for an upcoming fairy wedding. The king was furious and summoned all his subjects to find out who did this. Of course, all came except for the tiny wee fellow who was hiding out of guilt.
Oh no.
I mean, hey, pro tip, guys, if you're being summoned, you might want to go and try your best at deception, because not showing up kind of seems a little guilty. Since he was the only one not to appear, they quickly determined that he must have been responsible and was brought forth before the king.
Well, duh.
I mean, yeah, you're going to get found out if you're the only guy not showing up.
It's very stick your head in the sand tactics.
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad for him. This was just an accident. It wasn't like he was trying to be malicious. He's probably just scared, but you know, when you swear not to do something and then you do it, it's not going to be good.
Especially with fairies, because fairies don't care.
No, they don't. Don't mess with a fairy, man. They look cute, but man, we know enough stories to know if you cross one, you're in trouble.
But also, don't believe every romantasy book you read where the fairies are like these hot guys that will spirit you away and change your life and fight monsters for you. Fairies can be quite, they can be quite insane.
Yeah, quite tricksy and chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
The tiny wee fellow explained what happened, but the king would not hear any excuse. As punishment, he was banished to the land of the giants forevermore, until he could find a giant willing to guard the fairy tree. Everyone was very sad upon hearing the sentence, for the tiny fairy was a fine fellow and a great bard liked by all. Before the little fellow was sent out into exile, the queen gave him some berries and told him to offer them to a giant who may guard the tree, and instructed him to tell the giant that if they agreed to guard the tree, they may feast on the berries from dawn till dusk. He thanked the queen and then set off for the mountains where the land of the giants lay beyond. All the fairies waved their little red caps as he left until he could be seen no more.
Aww.
I know, it's so sad. Also, just that little red cap detail is so cute.
They're all just like, bye, we'll see you never.
Yeah. Did you ever play The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap?
No, I don't think so.
No. Whenever I read this, I think of there's little creatures in that called Minish, which are like super, super tiny creatures, and they've got these tall, red, pointy hats. It's very adorable. They're very much must be inspired by fairies, but like the detail of the red cap is very much in line with that. As he reached the peak of the mountains, the wee fellow turned around to see fairyland one last time, but a dark, thick cloud blocked it from his view. With great sadness, he continued down the mountain. The next day, he awoke abruptly as the ground trembled and a thunderous noise filled his ears. He looked up to see a terrible giant looming over him. He had one eye in the middle of his forehead that burned like live coal. His mouth stretched from ear to ear with sharp, jagged teeth, and his chest and arms were covered in black, shaggy hair. He wore an iron band that was chained to a great club with iron spikes. This was Sharvan the Surly, a fearsome giant who could break rocks with a single swing from his club. He was incredibly sturdy. No weapons or fire could hurt him, except 3 swings from his club.
From his own club?
Yeah, his own club. So, when I read this, it very much read to me as, like, the important hint you're given in a video game quest. Like, okay, so that's how I defeat the boss. I'm going to have to do something to knock it out of his hand and then pick it up and then hit him with it. And I'll have to do it 3 times. Spoilers, this will not come into play at all.
No, I don't think the little guy's going to do it.
No, but it is a red herring, but I really love the detail of like, it's very subtly said, but this guy has one weakness, which is his own club. But perhaps another story plays out what happens with that detail. I like to think that maybe there's another tale kind of going into what happens with him, but in this story, that will not play out. But we at least all know if we ever come across this guy, what we need to do now. His shouts sounded like thunder to the poor little fairy, leaving him trembling before the giant. Sharvan asked the fairy what he was doing in these lands. The fairy explained that he was banished until he could find a giant to guard the fairy tree in Dooros woods. Seeing the shaking, fear-filled fairy before him, the giant felt very guilty for scaring him and gently lifted him up. With a softer tone, he told... Yeah, he's scary, but he's a gentle giant. The text even kind of describes how, like, the little fairy just kind of fits between his thumb and his finger. And that's just where it sits as he lifts it up. It was very cute. With a softer tone, he told him he need not be afraid and asked the fairy to tell him more about the tree. The fairy told him all about the fairy tree, how it grows incredible berries, and why it needs protection. He then pulls out 3 berries the queen gave him and offers them to the giant. He examines the berries closely before eating them all at once. The giant felt such joy from eating them that he began to shout and dance. Some giants heard the commotion Sharvan had caused and came over to find out what was happening. Sharvan quickly hid the fairy in his wallet before telling them that he had just stubbed his toe. While the other giants weren't convinced that those were shouts of pain, they suspected it sounded more of joy, but they also did not want to mess with Sharvan, so they decided it was best to leave it alone and just move on. After he left, Sharvan took the fairy out and asked for his name and if he could have more of the berries. The wee fairy said his name was Pinkeen, and he had no berries left. But if he agreed to guard the fairy tree in Dooros, he could eat as many as he wanted. Sharvan said he would happily guard the whole woods if he must, but Pinkeen assured him that it was only the one tree that needed guarding. So the two made their way first to Fairyland to deliver the news to the king and queen. When they reached the peak of the mountain to Fairyland, Sharvan took one final look at the land of the giants, but could see nothing for a dark, thick cloud was blocking it from his view. All he saw before him was the lush green woods and sparkling waters of the Fairyland down below. As they were about to cross the border into Fairyland, Sharvan's feet became stuck to the ground and he was unable to move. He shouted in a rage which was heard all across Fairyland. Pinkeen dashed ahead and told all the scared fairies that they didn't need to be afraid, for the giant agreed to guard the tree for him. The king nodded in approval and pardoned little Pinkeen. All the fairies cheered, threw their little red hats in the air, and began to celebrate that their friend had returned. But also, guys, like, he was gone for a day, so we can chill a little.
The shortest quest ever.
Yeah. First guy he met totally agreed and was like, I spent a night out there.
Just literally there and back again.
The king sent one of his pages to bring the giant some berries and show him the way to Dooros Woods. The page flew off to the giant, who was still in a rage at being restrained. But after he ate a few berries, he became much more joy-filled and respectfully asked for the restrained spell to be removed. The page removed the spell with the giant's promise that he would not try to cross the fairyland border again. I feel like that's a little weird because, like, Pinkeen was the one who brought him. Like, he was just kind of following what Pinkeen was telling him. He wasn't trying to invade or anything like that, so...
Yeah, but fairies.
Fairies be fairies, bro.
Yeah, most of the time you can explain things with just fairies being not very nice.
Yeah. They're just being, you know... They just want to have the last laugh.
Mm-hmm. And knowing fairies, they probably think they're better than the giants.
This is true. Honestly, I think this relationship is actually going fairly well, all things considered.
Yeah. I mean, no one killed anyone else.
Not yet, anyways.
Not yet, anyways.
They traveled together away from Fairyland to the Dooros Woods, where they found the fairy tree. When Sharvan saw the glistening red berries, he shouted for joy, which was so strong that the wind of it blew the poor page all the way back to Fairyland. Unfortunately for him, he still had to relay instructions to the giant, so the page had to make his slow journey back to return to the tree, where the giant had already had a face full of berries. He instructed the giant that during the day he must sit at the foot of the tree to fight off any who dare steal the berries, and at night he is to sleep amongst the branches. Soon enough, word spread of the fairy tree in Dooros Woods. Every day an adventurer would come and try to take the berries. But the giant kept his word, and every day slew an adventurer or champion without ever being wounded himself. Now, I know what you're all thinking. What kind of fairy tale is this? There's not even a prince or princess with an animal companion. Don't worry, because this is the part of the story where we get all of the fairy tale classics. So make sure you've got your fairy tale bingo sheet ready to go, because we're about to hit a lot of them. I feel like we should make one at some point and actually have it on the website so that people could have...
Dead Mother would be on there.
Oh, for sure. Talking animal or like an animal companion would have to be up there. Prince or princess. A transformation of some kind.
A poor person. There's always poor people.
Poor person acquiring riches through crazy means. Yeah, there's a lot of things we could put up there. We'll have to add that to the list. But if you happen to have your own bingo sheet, I think you're about to check off a bunch of the classics here. While Sharvan kept his promise to guard the tree and honestly just be an absolute legend doing it, we turn our attention to a nearby kingdom ruled by a cruel king. So you can check that one off. We've got a villainous king at play. You see, he gained his position by killing the previous king, who was beloved by his subjects. But while the people hated the new guy who usurped his way to the throne, they feared him even more, so they could do nothing. The murdered king left behind 2 children who were also beloved by the people. The eldest was a boy named Niall, and the youngest was Rosaline, who was fairer and more beautiful than any flower. The tyrannical king feared what the people would do if he killed the 2 children. So instead, he sent the boy away at sea in an open boat, hoping the waves would swallow him. And then he sent the girl to an old witch who cast a spell of deformity on her, which made Rosaline hideous to behold. She became so ugly that none would approach her, and so she began living on the outskirts of town where the cattle slept. I'm just saying, if they were so beloved by the people, why did they completely shun her when her, face changed a bit?
Because they loved her because she was beautiful.
That's right.
Well, that would be a bingo thing, right? It would be goodness equals beauty. It's always the beautiful steps, the beautiful daughter versus the ugly daughter. It's always like beauty is goodness. So if you're ugly, you're bad. Sorry.
That's actually kind of the interesting thing. I'll jump ahead here for a second, but we do learn that the tyrannical king has a beautiful daughter. And it's restated a couple times, like, this is a very evil king, but his daughter is also beautiful. Granted, she's not as beautiful as Rosaline when she had her original beauty, but that is also always acknowledged. So it's kind of an interesting change that they've kind of acknowledged that, when that's normally the trope that you can't be pretty and evil.
Well, she's not as beautiful.
That's the key identifier, just not as beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Just not as beautiful.
Mm-hmm. While Rosaline was very lonely, she did have one friend, a little robin bird. Every day, the robin sang sweetly to Rosaline until she forgot her misery and loneliness. She was very happy to have someone who would not shun her for her appearance. One day, the robin saw the tyrannical king's beautiful daughter come by to mock Rosaline in her ugly state. As soon as she left, Rosaline began to cry her eyes out. The robin hopped onto her shoulder and tried to comfort her as best as he could. She was grateful for her friend, but the robin wanted to help her more. So he flew out to meet his cousin in the Dooros woods and explained Rosaline's situation. They both agreed the fairy berries could help, but the cousin informed the robin of a fearsome giant that now guards the tree. While he is there both day and night, the robin of the woods believed there may be one opportunity to get a berry, but it would be very dangerous. The cousin explains that every day a champion comes to challenge the giant. Before the fight begins, the giant takes a small branch of berries and puts it in his belt. This is so he can grab one mid-fight if he needs to be refreshed. While the fight is happening, they may have a slight chance to swoop in and take a berry out from under the giant's nose. But they say the giant's breath is poisonous to birds and bees, so if he turns to see them when they are close, they will surely perish. But my question is, if the giant's distracted fighting the champion, why don't they just go to the tree while he's focused on the champion instead of going for the berry that's close to the giant?
I don't know. It seems like fairy tale logic.
Yeah.
Because it seems a lot harder to get to the giant while it's mid-fight than to just sneak in and get it from the actual tree.
But I guess this is way cooler and like a much better story.
Versus a heist.
You know me, I love a good heist. Gosh. I also like this little detail that the giant's breath is poisonous. And to me, it just feels like that's the perfect ad placement for like a toothpaste or something like that.
Giant's breath could kill you with one blow.
But after I started using Colgate, that went away.
Now I don't kill any birds, and they sing right next to me like I'm Snow White.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Despite the risk, Rosaline's little robin friend affirms his determination and resolve to help her. With that, the two birds fly into the woods where the fairy tree is. They did not need to wait long until a warrior came and challenged the giant to a battle. Lo and behold, they saw the giant take a small branch of berries and place it on his belt before charging at his opponent. Eventually, the giant knocked the warrior down, but in doing so, he stumbled himself. The robin steeled himself and swooped in and snatched a single berry from the branch while the giant was recovering. The robin flew home as quickly as his little wings could take him. As he flew overhead, he saw a group of knights marching along on white steeds. Many wore silver armaments, but they were all led by a horseman wearing a golden helmet. Flying past them, the robin lands on Rosaline's shoulder and feeds her the berry before she can say anything at all. She quickly eats it, for it's the most delicious food she has ever eaten in her life. And sure enough, the old witch's spell fades, and Rosaline becomes lovelier than any flower once again. Shortly after, the knights marched by, and the leader with the golden helmet leaped from his horse and kneeled before Rosaline. He said that he was the prince of the Sunny Valley, and she must be the king's daughter, for she is the fairest maiden of them all, even without all the royal pedigree around her. She told him that she was indeed a king's daughter, but not the king who rules these realms. With that, she fled, leaving the prince puzzled by her words. The prince and his men continued to the king's castle. The king threw a great feast in the guests' honor, but all the prince could think about was the fair maiden he had met earlier that day. At the end of the evening, the king asked why the prince had come to the kingdom. The prince confessed that he was looking for a bride, and he believed he had found the fairest woman of them all, whom he would like to marry her, and he met her earlier that day. The king's daughter blushed because she believed he was talking about her. But before we could play out that funny comedic setup there was a great bang at the front gates. Everyone drew their blades, prepared for a fight, but who should enter but a battle champion with similar features to the murdered king? "It's the late king's son, Niall, who's come back to take his father's throne," the bards exclaimed. Everyone cried out, "Long live Niall!" The king, outraged by how quickly the chiefs and nobles flipped on him, rushed at Niall, but he was disarmed by a dozen of the chiefs before he could even get close to him. While this was going on, the king's daughter fled the castle, but Rosaline came inside to see what the commotion was about. And when Niall saw her, he gave her a great big hug, happy to be reunited with his little sister once more. The feast started up again, and everyone heard Niall tell his adventures. Eventually, the prince of the Sunny Valley asks Niall for Rosaline's hand in marriage. Niall tells his sister that she may speak for herself, and she excitedly says yes, and the two were happily married. Of course, she did not forget the little Robin, who was her friend even in her sorrow. She took him with her to the Sunny Valley where she lived, and she fed him, and he sang sweet songs to her every day. And they all lived happily ever after.
Aww.
And that is the tale of the fairy tree of Dooros.
I quite enjoyed that. I thought it was very different from some of the other fairy stories we've done recently.
It had it had some mischief in it, but not so much so, and there was a lot of different characters involved with it. It wasn't so much as like the fairy versus the human. We have like giants involved. We have the prince and princess and like the bird that came to kind of be involved in all of this. And they're all kind of loosely connected to each other.
Mm-hmm. A 2-part story.
It really is. The whole story is just one long story, but I broke this up as 2 parts. The first part I called Of Fairies and Giants, and part 2 being of the princess and her robin friend. Because it really does feel like you could have ended the first one with where the giant starts to guard the tree. Like, you could have left it there, and it's like, and that's why we don't go into these woods, right? You could have left it that's the explanation. But then we added a cute little love story at the end with a evil king and a prince who went out into the world and returned to claim his throne. Like, I don't know. This is great.
It hits all of the high points.
I also think it's really interesting that, like, the story starts from the fairies' point of view. Like, I feel like so often the stories with fairies, we're seeing it from a human point of view, and then the fairy just happens to be there. So this was very fascinating that the fairies were the viewpoint for a good while.
Yeah, and I think the fairies are usually considered like the helper creature or the villain creature, where they play a role, but the role is not necessarily to be the main character, whereas we have a main character. And he goes on a little journey.
And, like, Pinkeen was very much the main character for the first half, but he never meets Rosaline, who is very much the main character in the second half. So that's very unique in that sense, that these characters don't kind of overlap.
Yeah, I quite like that as well.
Yeah, I also just love that the reason all of this happened was because the fairies partied too hard after a sports victory.
It all comes back to she's the man.
Yes, exactly. Even we can go back to Shakespeare, it's Puck, it's all this stuff. But with that, thank you, dear travelers, for joining us for this very nice episode.
And as always, if you want to see the show summary or notes, then check out our website, www.talesfromenchanted.forest.com. And if you do want to hear more from us, you can check us out on Bluesky, From Enchanted, or most other social media sites under our podcast name. However, if you are old school like Sparrow, you can always email us at talesfromenchantedforest@gmail.com.
And remember, there's always a place for you in the Enchanted Forest.